Hey everybody, today we're looking into a subculture who... Where's that hepping coming from? A subculture who... Wait, let me do something.
The story will continue after this.
There we go. The voices are all gone. So who are these Hepcats and what did they do? The Hepcat is just another word for the first iteration of hipsters who were present in the US in the 1940s. In the Hepcat's own language of jive talk, the word is equitable to that of a knowledgeable person. But in the eyes of history, this street-smart jazz head would go from the underground cool guy to the 40s hipster. More on jive talking later. These hipsters would be present in American culture since the 20s, only coming to wider public attention over the coming decades before falling to the beatniks, greasers, and bikers of the 1950s. So before I accidentally set the world on fire by going too far into the Cold War, let's get a look at what made these cats hip. I mean hep. Yeah, hep. It all goes back to that swinging decade of a century ago, where we'd see the beginnings of a new renaissance outside of Europe. The Harlem Renaissance, as it would be dubbed, was a near two-decade advancement of black identity in American culture, in both the arts and throughout popular culture itself. The white American public would take notice of creatives like Duke Ellington, Fats Waller, Langston Hughes, and Ann Spencer, leading to a new public perception of the black identity with the term New Negro, something which would counteract years of Jim Crow. While primarily a movement built and supported by the African American community, there were outside influences who would help open doors whose handles were placed across the line of racial prejudice. Carl Van Vechten, Charlotte Mason, and a spattering of white patrons would join the black community in promoting it. Unsurprisingly, with some rich white guy or gal saying this stuff was cool, the average American would take notice, and we would see the building of a larger appeal of jazz culture, along with a few who saw the Renaissance more through the lens of early anthropology, and wanted to see how these savages could have culture. The appeal of the Renaissance to the white American public would be one of many examples of a forthcoming cultural diffusion, with trends at a time leading black figures to come to prominence. Now, the actual Hepcats wouldn't be seen until the next decade, with the archetype of one coming about during the later years of the Harlem Renaissance. But jazz would begin to take strides into the public psyche. Musicians from Louis Armstrong to Willie Smith would play in predominantly black clubs for the underground jazz scene that existed from coast to coast. Jazz clubs that, alongside less racially exclusive and wider places throughout New York, would later be introduced to the wider public as hotspots for what was new and hip. Thanks in part to elements of the Renaissance, Prohibition, and a wider appeal of black culture to America's white middle class, jazz would enter popular culture, and with it, a lifestyle common in the cultural psyche of 1920s America. One of fast-paced swing mixed with the illicit substances of reefer and alcohol. For it would be in this time period, along with the rise of the Hepcats, that modern weed culture would plant its roots both within jazz heads and regional scenes the country over. Now let's move on to the reason we're all here, those cool cats who know what hep is. The 1930s would be where the Hepcat subculture took its first strides into the world. Growing from the Harlem Renaissance, and influenced by black culture at the time, hep would be born. While the term is of unknown origin outside its association with the jazz scene, it would describe the decade's culture perfectly. Jazz, zoot suits, and black roots. Jazz itself originated in black communities within New Orleans and throughout the rest of the US South in the mid-19th century, spawning off of West African, Black Caribbean, and a later addition of ragtime and Dixieland stylings. This combination of musical majesty would lead to the genre's rising popularity during the 1920s and 30s. More specifically in our case, the subgenres of swing jazz of the late 20s to early 40s, and an upbeat form of blues referred to as jump, both of which were musical staples for the Hepcat. These two subgenres came about because of musicians fiddling with tempos and theming, taking the improvisational nature of jazz and blues' influence to welcome conclusions. And seeing as there's only so much you can dissect jazz before it loses its majesty, we're going to move on to something that actually needs cutting, needle, and thread. The zoot suits were a style of men's fashion that originated in the early 20th century thanks to black comedians wearing baggy or oversized suits. This style would spread to a wider African American audience throughout the 20s thanks to the looseness helping with dancing to faster music. Outside of the Hepcats, a lot of other non-white groups in the US would become associated with these outfits, including Filipino, Japanese, and Mexican Americans, notably the Chicano Pachuco subculture, the last of which has embraced the fashion as a symbol. The zoot suit itself has been described by several sources as outspokenly American, so much so that the larger amount of fabric these things used was criticized during the 40s and wartime rationing. A bit of a tangent, but a lot of black and white photos don't really capture that image of a Zoot suit. So I convinced the guy who does the other half of the editing to go out and scrounge together some color photos so you know it wasn't all black and white outside of photographic limitations and race. The suit itself would hold its influence over American culture during the heyday of the Hepcat and later hipster, influencing other groups years later. As for how we got hep in the first place, well, it's a word of undeterminable origin from within African American vernacular English. The word hep itself possibly originates from a mishearing of hip, as one jazz dictionary would point out near the end of the hipster age. But the word itself was traced back to near the beginning of the century by a few other etymological sources. What can be said about hep was that it was what is, and what was in for the time was hep. With the term cat, it's easier to trace, just not to a point as to why it's used. Cat itself was associated with jazz culture of the late 19th century. Different sources will point to different contexts for cat being a person, with one attribution being towards the musicians themselves, who were up all night like one or smooth and agile in how they performed. Hence, cool cats still being used in jazz vernacular. Another source points to the Wolof word for singer, woikat, which would tie into the African roots of the music genre. Regardless of wherever this mysterious source actually was, the cat was one who knew what was, and hep was happening. Through the 30s, hep would be more associated with black, and some white, musicians while holding a more underground status thanks to its racial and in some cases cultural and economic differences. Clubs throughout Harlem, New Orleans, California, and anywhere in between would accentuate both jive music and its way of life. Hep's popularity would be thanks only to some of the heppest of cats, including one man who would hold the title as a band leader. Callaway, if you're younger than my octogenarian grandmother, you may remember him from his appearance in the Blues Brothers. Or if you're like me, born after 1994 and interested in animation as a kid, you may know him from the old Fleischer cartoons on YouTube. While not as timeless as Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, or even Duke Ellington in the grander scheme of jazz music, Callaway would almost entirely command the popular image of a hepcat during the 30s and 40s. For his presence on stage and in song, serving as a sort of authority on what was hep and what was out, Callaway, like many others, would help shape it as well. Songs like 1932's Reefer Man, 39's Jumpin' Jive, even what all featured Callaway and Fleischer cartoons incorporated both his scat style of singing and the same music associated with hep and its culture. Other acts like trumpeters Louis Jordan and Armstrong, bandleader Count Basie, and singers like the rapturous Billie Holiday would provide the soundtrack to hep through fast-paced swing and jump tunes. The 30s hepcat was regarded more as a black icon, someone who was with it and knew the art of cool. This would rub off on the wider American public, where a broader audience would be enticed by the fast beats, wild dancing, and colorful stylings. Throughout the decade, hep cared not for race or where you came from, only that you knew what truly was hep and weren't square. An anecdote I'm definitely not paraphrasing from Wikipedia goes as follows. I don't care who that Clark Gable guy is, all I want to know is if he can dance. Hep was open to those who could work with it, rejecting all that couldn't jive talk and navigate the scene. Back of Callaway, the hipster himself would release a dictionary in 1938 documenting copious words from jive talk. And because I've already talked too much, here's a clip from 1944 that will probably copyright claim this video, along with a few examples in text.
If you want to learn the lingo jive from A, B, C to Z, get Hep to Hep's Dictionary. It'll tell you what's a blip, it'll tell you how to get hip, it'll tell you what's proper too. Anything you want to know from a howdy-howdy-ho to a square barbecue.
As for the continued history of hep, we'll have to move further than a few clips from the 1930s and look at what's going on around them. So here's where we see a similar repeat of the Renaissance with a popular enamoration of the hepcat figure. While predominantly seen as underground a culture could get compared to the mainstream, well, with it being black, urban, and associated with things not common to the American wasp, hep culture would interest the middle-class white American much like the Renaissance a few years earlier. It was seen as something alien, something that would enthrall young adults as this new experience that would put the last decade's fads to shame and have their successionist grandparents spinning in their graves. With this, hep would see a shift in appeal towards the wider side of America. Come the 1940s, and all the geopolitical stability that it brought, there would be a shift in attitude towards the kind of jazz that all the cool cats wanted to hear. Swing was booted out the door about the same time as the Axis powers were, because bebop was here to stay. Until it became square by the 50s. Bebop jazz was more erratic compared to swing, keeping its fast tempo but adding influences from scat and possessing a more improvised set of tunes. Bebop of the late 40s, or for the hipsters when it was cool, was rougher compared to that of the 50s. By the mid-40s, hip would rise to prominence, Coinciding with the same changes in musical taste, hip was to replace hep because hep became too mainstream and was no longer hip. So where we once had the Hepcat, now comes the hipster. The hipster of the 40s would be more or less similar to the Hepcat. Just as similar as you could get while trying to get a healthy amount of distance between the two terms so you still felt with it. Ironically, to the identity built over the past decade, it would be a white musician who would coin the new term for the less underground black culture that would overtake hip. Harry Gibson, earning himself the moniker the hipster, helped usher in hip over hep to keep the jive talking and cool tunes free from the squaredom that befell swing. Other white musicians like Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and Benny Goodman, who would be considered among some of the first hipsters of the decade, would help bring bebop and hotter, hipper forms of jazz and hip fashion more mainstream than Callaway or Basie, while also trying to work off that underground appeal associated with anything black at the time. Hip of the 40s was a sort of halfway point for America between the Hepcat and hippie mentality. Along with the rocketing of jazzy tunes into the mainstream, more liberal ideas were thrown into our culture of hip. Chiefly, free radical thoughts that were floating around over the last 20 years. A more overt attitude towards sexuality, recreational drug usage, and racial diversity. While the outer two would loosely help birth changes that would be seen starting in the 50s, mostly the swinger subculture and end of segregation, recreational drug use was different. Associated with reefer, a term for marijuana, the 40s hipster would see the devil's lettuce as a way to explore something new and rebel against squaredom. For some added context, American weed culture, which has existed as long as the plant has been grown in the country in one form or another, didn't really take off until the hipster. For while there were the occasional groups associated with weed on and off in US history, it would be with the Hepcat and hipster that marijuana would gain traction thanks to the drug's more taboo status. Hip weed culture isn't that different from general weed culture we see nowadays, what with people smoking it at home or at parties. An infatuation with the substance, and its own slang. The Hepcat and hipster had many terms for pot, calling it tea, reefer, or whatever else you want. It was weed, the devil's lettuce, Mary Jane, ganja, the... Marijuana was inescapable from the grasp of hip culture. The ideas behind the hipster of the 40s would evolve closer to the 50s, culminating on another hip scene of people referred to as beatniks. With the rise of both the beatnik and eventual rise of the hippie a decade later, the jazz hipster would finally exit stage right. However, one American writer, and an influence of 60s and 70s journalism, would capture the inspiration of why the hipster came about in his 1955 essay, The White Negro. Norman Mailer, born in the decade of the Harlem Renaissance, could be considered at the same level as Carl Van Vechten when it came to African Americans. That being, he was enamored with their culture. So much so that it would be wrong of me not to point out that he saw jazz as accentuated black bravado and felt they were more masculine than he ever could be. Working off this essay that could not be published today due to a variety of reasons, Mailer's hipster of the last decade was that of a pleasure-seeking youth wanting adventure and rebellion. Such could be found in American black culture of the time, where a mingling of new ideas and variations on old ones would rewire the brains of a malleable white middle class to be more open to the outside. The influence of the hipster, and by extension the Hepcat, is one of being ahead of and rebelling against the mainstream as a trendsetter. This idea would influence other groups like the Beatniks a decade later, the 60s hippie, and everything that followed suit. This wasn't in the States either. Groups like the Soviet Stilyagi, British Teds, and even the French Zoot were influenced in one form or another by this jive jazz culture. To Mailer, the hipster of the post-war US was what he quintessentially dubbed the American existentialist, one who worked to enlighten themselves and others in an era of post-wartime atrocities as an act of rebellion through ways that were not in the mainstream, cementing the idea of the hipster as this person who was usually ahead of the times culturally. Again, with more progressive ideas socially on a lot of things. This leads to modern hipsters that we've been seeing since the mid-2000s, but that's yet another story for another time, maybe even one with a more lenient deadline. So who exactly were these hipsters, and more obviously Hepcats, of the days of yore? The original hipsters, the Hepcats, were black Americans from urban centers across the nation, predominant within jazz communities from New York to New Orleans to Old New California. These Hepcats would be denoted by swing jazz, jump blues, and fashionable zoot suits on top of their jive talking and jiver attitudes. They were the roots of the subculture, with both music and fashion stemming off of African American tastes and cultural heritage. Notable individuals who were part of this group include people like Cab Calloway, Louis Jordan, Charlie Parker, and a young Malcolm X. The Hepcats, and later hipsters of the black community, would be given the spotlight during the lead up to the 50s. Alongside this would be a metaphorical death, for to truly be hep or hip, one had to be out of the mainstream. Yet it would be with the hipsters, the latecomers and later status quo after the Hepcats, that cool would be redefined alongside gaining more traction with white Americans. predominantly the white middle class and mostly younger generations. They would be enamored, much like Mailer and Van Vechten, by the smooth tunes and fashions of Black America. It would be with the hipster of the 40s that whatever was underground was dug up and presented as the next big thing. And with the influence of this white middle class, we would see a spreading influence to groups like the Stilyagi, Beatniks, and other jazz-related communities for years to come. So in a way, the hipster of the 40s lived up to its modern connotations as a trendsetter, just operating more like culture at the time did and bringing something that was not known but still in practice to the right people. But why exactly did they do that? For the original Hepcats, this was cultural expression. Jazz, jive talk, and fashions like the Zoot suit were from black origins. So to them, it was wearing their identity out for the world to see. They were also surprisingly more apolitical in comparison to the whiter hipster. But this probably has more to do with the black cats and hipsters expressing themselves and not rebelling against social norms that didn't really apply to them, because their actions alone were more political than one would think, with jazz groups and some clubs only caring about you if you knew what was in rather than how pale you were like a few groups across the ocean at the same time would. It would later be adopted by wider audiences both as hip and hep, not just for the same reasons. As we've mentioned before, white America fell for both because they existed outside their connotations of normal, which also leads us to asking about the wider adoption of hip by white Americans. For the white hipster, we'll have to look at what Mailer had to say about who he dubbed America's existentialist. The American existentialist, the hipster, the man who knows that if our collective condition is to live with instant death by atomic war, relatively quick by the state as l'univers concentrationnaire, or with slow death by conformity with every creative and rebellious instinct stifled, if the fate of 20th century man is to live with death from adolescence to premature senescence, why then the only life-giving answer is to accept the terms of death, to live with death as immediate danger, to divorce oneself from society, to exist without roots, to set out on that uncharted journey into the rebellious imperatives of the self. This guy really would have been good enough to channel considering how often I see subcultures as escapes from reality. This analysis can be seen as a more carefree emulation of the jazz lifestyle, both as a celebration of a new piece and to say that in a societal manner, American culture would never have this happen again. That these hipsters would celebrate life like each day was their last. A bit bohemian in interpretation, but Mailer probably put it better. A quintessentially American response to the orderly atrocities of the Nazi death camps and nuclear bombs. He also made comparisons to hipsters and psychopaths, that being where the psychopath, in his eyes, looked for a bigger and better orgasmic dopamine hit. The hipster would get the same high from living a lifestyle of exorbitance, and emulating the same low point of addiction seen in stars like Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker. Surprisingly, the lifestyle of bandleader King Oliver wouldn't reach the American public until the next century. This psychopathic appeal does apply to other subcultures as well, with the more contemporary lifestyles of both the rock star of the 70s and 80s and the rapper of the new millennia being focal points for this very same people chasing this high. Working again off the ideas of Mailer, along with the idea of a return to normalcy presented by some sources in our Stilyagi video, this embracing of all things hip was their way of saying the new normal was not that which brought about their Führer, Il Duce, and Showa's militarism. Rather, it was one that said happy days would be here to stay. Other than what Mailer has said with a more bohemian response in the wake of the Harlem Renaissance, the hipster of the 40s came about because of a love and eventual emulation of the jazz lifestyle. Like what all has been mentioned in the history bit, there was an appeal of this underground jazz culture to the wider white middle class in the States. Be it wearing zoot suits, dancing at the Savoy, or talking jive while smoking dope. These newcomers to hep and hip were enamored with such a lifestyle and wanted to embrace it as best they could. To paraphrase poet Langston Hughes, Harlem was in vogue once more. This is more a general observation, but there's an appeal of underground or near underground cultures. Something we still see today with whatever aesthetic or core is trending on TikTok, Tumblr, or Twitter. For while there are people who actually love to live these lifestyles, it usually seems easier to LARP than to play the part. Unlike modern cultural LARPers, the white hipster embraced the culture that came alongside it, which does prove a bit tricky to discuss without throwing out some criticisms its way. So we'll put that aside for now, and seeing as such, emulation or LARPing of hep and hip culture wouldn't come about until at least the 90s, with swing revival. Luckily, some other things would not come back alongside dudes like this listening to Cherry Poppin' Daddies. So let's see what all was bad about everything hip and hep. Sounding a bit like everyone's worried suburban Protestant mutter, a lifestyle of drug usage was associated with the hipster. Granted, this comes with any territory when you see things like weed or any other recreational drug as just a way to relax. Now the term dope fiend is used more in a 40s connotation here, but outside a love of Mary Jane before an unrelated Tom Petty song a few decades later, jazz culture had its share of bad habits that would wear off on some impressionable white kids. From weed to morphine, even harder stuff like heroin, it would all be done with the intent to rebel against the norms, chasing a high much like their icons did. One of the critically worst films ever made, 1937's Reefer Madness, shows a more caricatured image of drug usage. Ironically, weed itself was safer than a lot of drugs at the time, as the addictive morphine and illicit heroin were deadly to say the least. But as someone who has lived in a building of nearly a whole floor of stoners, I can see how Reefer Madness takes control of people, especially their sense of smell. So while weed wasn't really much of an issue outside of social stigma, my parole officer still wants me to tell you that drugs are bad and you should be as straight edge as the alcoholic I have writing this sentence. There's also a very murky quagmire I've mentioned offhandedly throughout the episode. The term, I don't know if I can get away with this word, even in the context of this video, so here's a late 70s hit that will do it for me. Refers to a white person who presents characteristics associated with black culture. And for the remainder of this video, I'm just going to be referring to them as posers to avoid a pejorative and its counterpart altogether. These posers, much like what all we've brought up in this video about LARPing and the mainstream appeal of particular groups, present themselves as something they really couldn't be. In this case, it was young middle-class white Americans acting black because it was cool and countercultural for the time. While the jazz scene had its share of genuine white musicians like Bix Beiderbecke, Harry Gibson, and Eddie Lang, the emulation of black-based hep and later hip lifestyles would come from the white middle class of America's urban centers. Now while there were actual people who committed themselves to the jazz scene, doing all things associated with it for the sake of genuinely wanting to experience something culturally hidden away from them through decades of segregationist thought, the same thing can be said in the poser mentioned earlier. There's an appeal of either something alien or the very same which resonates with them on a personal level, like how a lot of collegiate and high school athletes will listen to whatever subgenre of hip-hop is popular that decade, regardless of racial and cultural makeup of the group. Much like the hipster, for the white poser and any other emulators of black culture, it connects to them on a more personal level. There's a sort of mixed bag of cultural diffusion. While you could probably write at least 4 term papers and get a doctorate in the concept alone, we're going to try and simplify what's meant here. What's good about diffusion, like the whitening of the hipster or the more contemporary suburban white kids going ghetto, is that it legitimizes viewpoints once set far away from the mainstream. It allows new ideas, new voices to enter the spaces that once excluded them. But where such diffusion falls is in its implementation. Much like a lot of corporate sensitivity training programs and half my experience of anthropological theory can tell you, it's a matter of context and execution. So, just don't go around being any white celebrity in the 80s or a few East Asian adverts from a while ago. This aside, both the black and white parts of the hipster would help shape the culture's identity for over a nearly 2-decade run of swing, jump, and later bebop, firmly cementing various aspects of what was hep and hip into the popular image of the times. The Hepcat, and by extension, the hipster. A 20-year-long solo of notes high and low on the bari sax of popular culture, echoed only decades later in idea after idea staying out of the spotlight known as the mainstream. While they tried to dance around it, both groups ended up there eventually, serving as trendsetters for countless others to roll over. It didn't matter if you were black or white, only that you knew what was in. With that, this has been Subculture Shock. We've reached the end of this little tiny music block for the season, so I'll see you next time.
Just go along making music all day long. When I'm making my music, I can't do nobody no harm. But who knows? Maybe I'll come up with a song